Hi, my name is Eliot Cohen. I'm the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy here at CSIS, and it's my great pleasure to welcome an old friend, Max Boot, to talk about his terrific new book, Reagan, His Life and Legend. Max, I think, is known to pretty much anybody who's going to be watching this. He's a columnist at the Washington Post. He's the author of a number of prize-winning books on irregular warfare, a biography of a very interesting American Edward Lansdale, and now a biography of Ronald Reagan, which has received glowing reviews in the New York Times, the Washington Post, I think well beyond the norm. I think it's already on the bestseller lists, if I'm not mistaken, and deservedly so. Having read it, I can just tell you it is a wonderfully written book. I mean, as you can see, it's not small, but you go through it at a good pace because the writing is just so good. And Max has done many other things, but I'm going to let those pass for now. So, Max, welcome to CSIS.
Thank you very much, Eliot. Pleasure to be here, and it's really, truly a privilege to be talking with somebody for whom I have such great respect as a historian, a writer, and a thinker.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. Okay, so Max, let's begin at the beginning. Why does the world need another biography of Ronald Reagan? And I ask that because there are a whole bunch of biographies. He's a president who's been pretty well written about. There is I don't know what you think of the other biographies. I remember reading there's a Lou Cannon biography, which I think for a while kind of held the field. A thoughtful journalist. There are memoirs by all of his various associates. Why this?
Well, the way I like to put it is that when I began work on this book in 2013, there were a lot of books about Ronald Reagan, and now there's even more books about Ronald Reagan. But I didn't think that there was really one definitive, balanced, objective biography that really placed him into historical perspective. And in part, I think that was because it normally takes a long time after the end of a presidency before you can really see where that president belongs in the grand sweep of American history. And so I really set out to write something that was balanced and objective. And I truly had no thesis for this book beyond the notion that I thought Ronald Reagan deserved a better biography because he was a very consequential president and I think deserved a more objective and complete treatment. And so what I set out to write was intended to be neither a hagiography nor a hit job, but rather a book that looked at Reagan in full and presented his strengths as well as his weaknesses, his achievements as well as his shortcomings. And so I was very gratified to see the New Yorker review, which said that Reagan, His Life and Legend aims to be the definitive biography, and it succeeds. So I felt like that was kind of my mission accomplished in the actual, not ironic sense of that phrase.
Yeah, indeed it is. I mean, when somebody can slap the word definitive on a book, that's yes. A wonderful thing
that
for an author.
Makes a decade of work worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely. Plus, and this I want to get into a little bit, I mean, there has been more and more material that has come out since the Cannon biography in particular. At some point I want to draw you out a little bit on what we now know from his letters and diaries, which I think were portrayed, and to some extent justifiably so, as giving us a sort of a more thoughtful Reagan than people were used to thinking about. But the second question that I want to ask is, okay, Reagan needs a biography. Why Max Boot? I mean, why? For any author, you devoted a decade of your life to this one guy about whom you have, I think, mixed opinions. It's fair to say. Your kind of historical background is much more actually in military history, where you really have written with great distinction, and plus a lot of contemporary kinds of things through your work at the Washington Post and elsewhere. Why Max Boot?
Well, I suppose it's always an act of hubris for any writer to think that they can wrestle any big subject down to the mat. But that was my ambition or hope with this book, and my gateway. I think I've kind of transitioned actually from what I like doing away from military history and towards biography. And I think my gateway drug was my book on Ed Lansdale and the American tragedy in Vietnam, which was telling the story of an American military involvement, but really telling the story of Ed Lansdale, who was this, as you know, this extraordinary covert operator who was so influential in both the Philippines and in Vietnam. And so that really got me interested and the vagaries of personality and how a life unfolds and all the different influences in it. And anybody who read that book knows I wasn't just writing about American military strategy, although I certainly wrote about that, but also writing about Ed Lansdale's great love affair with Pat Kelly, his longtime mistress, who eventually became his second wife. And so just fascinating to see the interplay of personality and drama. And so that was something that really captivated me. And then I was thinking, well, the perennial biographer's question, who do I write a biography of? And it just seemed like Reagan was kind of a big fat target sitting there because he is so consequential, so important, and there wasn't a great biography of him out there. If I wasn't going to write, a biography of George H.W. Bush because John Meacham did that. I wasn't going to write a biography of Lyndon Johnson because Bob Caro did that. But, those guys have not focused on Ronald Reagan. And so I thought there was an opportunity for me to do that.
But he is, I think, a uniquely frustrating subject for biographer. You have a wonderful quote from Edmund Morris, who wrote this big 3-volume biography of Teddy Roosevelt, which, as we were discussing in the green room, has some issues. But he tries to write a biography of Reagan. He kind of comes on the narrative device of putting himself in the story when he wasn't really there, which is bizarre. And you mentioned this, and with, I think, a slight smile, say, well, it's probably because it was just so hard to come to terms with who Reagan really was.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't Edmund's failure alone. Many others who tried to plumb the depths of Ronald Reagan came away equally frustrated. I mean, in the book I recount, for example, the frustrations that Peggy Noonan had when she was writing Reagan's farewell address. And this was towards the end of 1988, when she was sitting down with him in the Oval Office and trying to get him to reflect on his 8 years in office and to share some memories, some thoughts, regrets, some proud moments. And very frustrating experience because he was completely unself-reflective, refused to look at his own life critically, refused to, plumb his own feelings. And she ultimately came away and said, I concluded that I could not know him because he was essentially unknowable. And that was, I think, the general verdict of most people who were, quote unquote, close to Ronald Reagan. And so, of course, that does present an obvious challenge for any biographer. I guess one advantage I had over Edmund or others is that I didn't actually get a chance to sit down with Ronald Reagan and talk to him, because I'm sure that would have been a hugely frustrating experience because, of course, like Edmund or Peggy or anybody else, any kind of intellectual talking to him wants him to, reflect and to offer interesting insights, and he would just refuse to do that and just kind of revert off into his old talking points or jokes or anecdotes or whatever. And so that was not a fruitful way to get to know Ronald Reagan, I think. But there are ways to get to know Reagan, and a lot of it had to do with, talking to a lot of people who were close to him, reading a lot of things, to documents, letters that he produced, things written about him, products of his administration, but also things like, just going back to understanding his childhood, which obviously with any of us, our childhood is so consequential in shaping our personality, and just being able to do things like, I thought it was very helpful. There's a newspaper database called newspapers.com where you can read every issue of the Dixon Evening Telegraph, which was the newspaper in Reagan's hometown of Dixon, Illinois, when he was living there in the 1920s. And that just, in addition to letters that survive and reminiscences and other things, just like reading the daily newspaper gives you a tremendous sense of what life was actually like for little Dutch Reagan growing up.
Yeah, no, there's so many things in the book that you really convey marvelously, and that's certainly one of them. I want to read the last two paragraphs because I think they really capture the essence of your picture of him. So bear with me, everybody. Reagan's ascent was an outcome that no one in Dixon or even in Davenport could have predicted, and yet he made it look effortless. Perhaps his greatest achievement of all was that no matter how far or how fast he climbed, he never lost his trademark dignity, modesty, and grace, or forgot the Midwestern ethic that he had learned growing up. He was and always remained a quintessential product of early 20th century small-town America, with all the strengths and blind spots inherent to that time and place. The America into which he had been born, a laissez-faire land in which the federal government had scant power to collect tax revenue, protect the rights of minorities, or cushion the toll of economic adversity, had long vanished by the time of his death, yet he remained its faithful champion to the very end. Indeed, his success in embodying an idealized and sanitized image of America, an image that airbrushed out pervasive ills such as racism and discrimination, corrosive poverty, and widening inequality, made possible his rapid ascent and armored him against the many setbacks en route. Reagan was far from ordinary, but he had an innate understanding of ordinary Americans, at least ordinary white Americans, that carried him a long way in his storybook life. He charmed the Japanese public during his 1989 speaking tour the same way he had charmed so many different audiences in so many different roles over so many decades, as, in a reporter's words, a larger-than-life symbol of what they see as the old America of strength and can-do optimism. The power of that symbolism remains alluring and enduring even in the 20th century as the world continues to grapple with the impact of Reagan's complicated life and legacy. Whether he changed the world for better or worse, or more likely some of both, he undoubtedly left his strong footprints in the sand of time, as Jane Wyman, his first wife, told Nancy Reagan shortly after his death. I think it's a beautiful summary of the book. Okay, but at the end, was he a great president?
I believe he was. I mean, I don't think I'm,
I mean, because you document a lot of ways in which he fell short, wasn't paying attention, kind of misstated his accomplishments. So what made him a great president?
I mean, he was, to be sure, a flawed individual, as we all are, and had many setbacks along the way. And certainly there were huge problems in his presidency, which I go into, whether it was, ignoring the AIDS pandemic or the Iran-Contra scandal or the disaster of U.S. policy in Lebanon, which kind of resonates today. But despite all that, he is still rated as a top 10 president by most historians. And there was a poll of presidential historians which placed them a couple of years ago at number 9, I think, which is still a pretty significant achievement and one that I basically endorse. And I think
But let me interrupt you right there. I mean, does that mean that I'm not saying you say this because you don't, but does that mean we've all been sort of flim-flammed by the way he presented himself, which was and I remember this vividly as a young adult, which was extraordinarily attractive and eloquent and compelling. Was that just all kind of smoke and mirrors?
No, I don't think it was smoke and mirrors. I think it was a hugely effective performance as president, and I think he understood the performative aspects of the presidency, something that he learned, I think, watching his boyhood hero, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, watching how FDR communicated with and transfixed the nation in the 1930s. And I think Reagan was very similar in the 1980s. And you could say it's flim-flam or smoke and mirrors or pulling the wool over people's eyes. But I think there's a much more positive and accurate interpretation, which was that this was how he exercised presidential leadership and made use of the bully pulpit. There was actually a wonderful moment where Reagan was asked by an interviewer how a former actor could be president, and his reply was he didn't understand how anybody but an actor could be president. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And by the way, FDR was also often described as an actor and somebody who was acting before the nation, but it was a very successful act. And I think if you talk about what were Reagan's big achievements, I think there were basically two which placed him fairly high in the ranks of American presidents. The first of them was largely performative, and that was helping the nation to recover its self-confidence after the turmoil and troubles of the 1970s, the decade of Watergate and Vietnam and stagflation and the Iran hostage crisis and so many other woes. And Jimmy Carter did not understand how to rally the nation. And of course, he gave his famous malaise speech where he didn't actually use the word malaise, but it became known as the malaise speech because that was kind of indicative of his kind of scolding approach to the nation. And Reagan did not scold the nation. He inspired it and helped it to recover from the low point when he took over in 1981, such that by 1984, he was running on a theme of mourning in America. And it was convincing, in part because the nation had bounced back economically from the very deep recession of 81 to 83, but also because Reagan had never wavered in his faith in America as the shining city on a hill, and he kind of made Americans feel good about themselves again. I think that's a hugely significant achievement. He certainly, wrought a transformation in the armed forces, in part with the biggest peacetime defense buildup in U.S. history, but also in part because of the way he talked about the military and the respect he showed for soldiers. And, you could just see it in the way that pop culture transformed from, from Stripes and Private Benjamin to Top Gun and Rambo and the Hunt for Red October. There was just this tremendous increase in respect for the military. And it wasn't all Reagan, but Reagan certainly contributed to it. And I think the other big achievement, and I would say that what we were just discussing was the big achievement of his first term. The big achievement of his second term was working with Mikhail Gorbachev to peacefully end the Cold War. And that's an achievement that I think has often been misunderstood. And there's a legend that's going up around Ronald Reagan, propagated by many people, who suggests that he caused the bankruptcy of the Soviet Union and brought down the Berlin Wall. And they point to the fact that the giant, increase in defense spending, SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, his support for the Afghan Mujahideen and other anti-communist fighters around the world, and say that's what brought down the Soviet Union. And I take, a critical look at that, and my basic conclusion is it wasn't really those first-term policies that did it. They certainly had some impact, but they weren't necessarily leading the Soviet Union to become more accommodating. In fact, in 1983, there were a series of war scares which brought the two superpowers to the brink of conflict to a very dangerous degree. And Reagan actually understood that was going on, and he dialed it back in early 1984 with his Ivan and Anya speech, where he talked about how much ordinary Soviets like Ivan and Anya had in common with ordinary Americans like Jim and Sally, and how we had to work together for the common good and the peace of the world. But as he kept complaining, he wanted to meet with a Soviet leader, but they kept dying on him. So he had no partner for peace in his first term. And everything changed in '85 when Gorbachev came to power. And Gorbachev was really a black swan, somebody who rose to the top of this dictatorial system, but lost faith in that system and wanted to reform it. And he wasn't trying to reform it because he wanted to keep up with the Reagan defense buildup. He didn't want an arms race. He thought that all this money going to the Soviet defense industrial complex was very wasteful. He wanted the money to go to ordinary Soviet citizens instead. And I think it was really, although Reagan did not initiate Gorbachev's reforms, he certainly supported him. And I think Reagan deserves a ton of credit for understanding that Gorbachev was a different kind of communist leader, somebody he could do business with. And they established a rapport in Geneva at their first summit in 1985, which really changed history. And remember, a lot of people at the time, including a lot of conservatives like Caspar Weinberger and others, thought that Gorbachev was just the same old communist. He was just trying to pull the wool over our eyes, get us to lower our guard. But Reagan understood, no, there's something else going on here, in part encouraged by Margaret Thatcher, but understood that Gorbachev was somebody he could deal with. And I think that is not something you would expect from somebody like Ronald Reagan, who had been this hardline anti-communist his entire life, had opposed détente in the 1970s, and yet here he was working so closely and developing a friendship with the world's #1 communist. I think that was ultimately a tribute to his pragmatism, and the second big achievement that I think guarantees his place in the annals of American history.
No, I think that's a very good statement. I mean, and I think your portrayal of Reagan is as somebody who, although there's a side one doesn't care for, is a pragmatist. I'd also say on the first part, by the way, I personally completely agree with you. And it's partly because actually of the FDR comparison. I remember talking to my mother about what was it like being a teenager during the Depression, and she said, the thing is, when you heard Roosevelt over the radio, or you saw pictures of him driving with the cigarette in the cigarette holder and the big grin and so on, she said, you just felt, we'll get through this okay, we'll be better. And I think you're right. And I think one of the weaknesses of our politics is that the good politicians sometimes don't understand or are not particularly good at the performative parts of politics, which he unquestionably was. What do you make, Max, of the argument that he was an intellectually shallow man, fundamentally incurious? I think you sort of echoed that a little bit. But that argument about shallowness, and then what I'd like to hear you talk about is your response to the kind of counter argument which has been made. Well, if you look at the diaries and letters, he's really thinking all this stuff through. These are his own beliefs, which he has worked his way through. Talk us through that.
Well, like with a lot of things about Reagan, I think I would avoid the two extremes. One extreme is Clark Clifford called him an amiable dunce. The other extreme is to think that he was some kind of Machiavellian, mastermind who was orchestrating everything that was going on during his presidency. Neither was really the case. It was somewhere in the middle. I would say he was, a reasonably intelligent person, certainly plenty intelligent enough to do the job of being president. And, if you read his writings, you see that he was actually often a beautiful writer, and he had a real talent for getting to the core of an issue. And it wasn't just the question of reading speeches on a teleprompter, because, long before he'd become president, he was giving his own speeches without any speechwriters. And, Stu Spencer, who was his longtime political consultant, told me that Reagan was not just the best speech giver he ever met, but also the best speech writer. He was very, very good. Going back to the 1950s, working for GE, he would write things down in index cards, shuffle the cards, and come up with speeches, and then judge audience reaction. And if a card resonated, it stayed in the pile. If it didn't, it went into the trash bin. And he became a master orator through that practice, that trial and error practice of practicing time and time again. So, he certainly had the intellectual ability to handle the presidency and to be, in many ways, an effective leader. But as I also argue in the book, he was not interested in details, and often the details really mattered, but he wasn't interested in them. He was, the way I put it is, he was a great leader, but a very poor manager. And it wasn't just an intellectual issue there. There was also an issue of personality, because he was, surprisingly enough, he was very averse to conflict. I mean, you think of Ronald Reagan as being somebody who was not afraid to confront, whether it was the Airline Traffic Controllers Union or Soviet leaders or whoever, but in interpersonal relationships, he actually shied away from conflict, so he would not hold aides accountable when they screwed up, and he didn't really inquire too deeply into what they were doing. So, he was often kind of at the mercy of his subordinates, and when he had effective subordinates, he was very successful. For example, I think one of his most important decisions in his first term was appointing Jim Baker as White House Chief of Staff, sure, even though Baker was anathema to many conservatives, but he got things done and helped to make the first term such a big success. But then the second term got off to a very rocky start, because Don Regan, the Treasury Secretary, and Jim Baker kind of casually decided they'd like to swap jobs. And they presented this to Reagan at a 30-minute Oval Office meeting, and he kind of signed off on it without inquiring too deeply into whether Don Regan would be an effective White House Chief of Staff. And it turned out he was a disaster. As Jim Baker said to me, Don liked the chief part of the title, but he didn't understand that he was staff. He thought he was like the CEO of Merrill Lynch once again, and he had terrible political instincts. And so that paved the way for the Iran-Contra affair and the worst scandal of the presidency. So, I think those were significant defects. And Reagan was often just very aloof from what his subordinates were doing, often didn't understand the issues. And this was a problem. For example, why was U.S. policy in Lebanon such a disaster under Reagan, culminating, of course, in the bombing in the Marine barracks in Beirut? And a lot of it had to do, I think, with the fact that Reagan just did not understand the region. He'd never visited. He made one brief trip to Iran in the 1970s. And there was constant infighting between Secretary of State George Shultz and Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, and his people like Richard Pipes and others who observed him in NSC meetings. Their observation was he didn't really have the knowledge or the decisiveness to sort out the disagreements, and so he would kind of muddle along and kind of give both Cap and George the impression that he agreed with them. And so the result was U.S. policy didn't make a lick of sense, and a lot of Marines paid the price for that. So I think those were serious defects, but he probably would have been an even better president if he'd been more curious, had been more up on more issues, and had also been willing to hold subordinates more accountable for their success or lack thereof. But he was certainly no amiable dunce as the popular caricature had it when he took over.
Yeah, I remember as a student when he won the first time, the professoriate at Harvard were just stunned. And how could this happen? This guy for whom they had contempt, yeah, who they thought, this is like a third-rate actor. And I think not understanding any of that. Was he a man of deep convictions?
He was. He had a few very deep convictions.
And where did they come from?
That's a great question. I mean, you can trace them to, to various origins. I mean, I think, as I write in the book, I think he had a kind of a fundamentally pragmatic Midwestern ethos, which dates back to his childhood in small town Illinois. I think that the big conviction that he developed as an adult was, of course, his conservatism, which was a radical midlife departure from his earlier beliefs, because, of course...
How did that happen?
Well, that's a good question, because the way he described it is completely unhelpful and inaccurate, because he often said, I didn't desert my party deserted me, to suggest that somehow the Democrats had veered to the left and he was left standing in the center, which might have been accurate if he had become a Republican. Like 1972, he could say, oh, it was those damn hippies and George McGovern that made me a Republican. But he actually became a Republican in the 1950s when the Democratic Party was actually pretty conservative. It was led by Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson. In 1960, as you recall, John F. Kennedy ran to the right of Richard Nixon on defense policy. So this was not some kind of peacenik, anti-capitalism party. It was really Reagan that changed, not the Democratic Party. And from his days as a New Deal Democrat who idolized FDR in the 30s to being this very hardline right-winger in the 1960s. And so I trace his ideological odyssey beginning during World War II, where, as a highly paid movie actor, he was very unhappy about having to pay a 90% rate of personal income tax. Then after the war, his transformation accelerated when he became a central figure in the hothouse politics of Hollywood. He became president of the Screen Actors Guild. He was in the middle of these battles over communism in Hollywood. He testified before the House Un-American Affairs Committee. He was an FBI informant. He was very influenced by the FBI view that there was this made in the Kremlin plot to take over the movie industry, which I argue was exaggerated, but he genuinely believed it, and that made him into a very hardline anti-communist. And then his transformation was really complete in the 1950s when he was a spokesman for General Electric and host of General Electric Theater. And GE in those days was a very conservative company. They actually viewed, free market propaganda as being an inoculation against labor problems. And so they, made sure that all their managers read all these right-wing documents, whether it was magazines or books, often very incendiary, very right-wing. In fact, one of their executives likened their outlook to that of the John Birch Society. And Ronald Reagan was nothing if not a devoted employee. And so he had these long train rides across the country, because in those days he was afraid of flying. So he would take the train from LA to New York. He had a lot of time to read. And so he would read, Human Events, National Review, Hayek, Chambers, and a lot of other things that were, much farther to the right, much more conspiratorial. And he tended to believe it. And he was a very voracious but somewhat indiscriminate reader. And so he would often, I guess the way I would put it is he was often, he was not so much interested in the literal truth of what he was reading. He thought there was a larger emotional truth there. And if he believed in the larger emotional truth, then he would kind of cherry pick anecdotes to support his convictions. And often the things that he picked up were not strictly speaking true. So he became very devoted to faux quotes from communist leaders describing their supposed plot to take over America by winning the passage of social welfare legislation like Medicare and Medicaid. And all these quotes were made up by the John Birch Society or other, right-wing conspiratorial types. But he genuinely believed it, and that became a big part of his worldview, such that by 1964, when he made his debut on the national political stage, giving his famous Time for Choosing speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater, he was talking about his one-time party, the Democrats, the party of Jefferson, Jackson, and Cleveland, as he put it, taking America forward under the banners of Lenin, Marx, and Stalin. That's pretty incendiary language, and that's why a lot of liberals at the time were very alarmed by Reagan and thought he was a right-wing kook. But, as we've already discussed a little bit, and we can discuss more, his performance in office showed that no, he actually was able to pivot away from his campaign rhetoric and actually govern in a very pragmatic and moderate fashion, which I think surprised a lot of liberals and dismayed a lot of conservatives.
Would people have been as surprised if they knew about his record as governor of California? Because again, all this is bringing back memories of when I was a student. You would hear this, okay, this dangerous right-wing maniac, third-rate actor. And we'd say, well, he was the head of the Screen Actors Guild, which was a rather important union, and went through a lot of bruising fights there. And he was the two-term governor of California, where he did not govern like a maniac.
Right. Yeah.
Can you find the keys to his actual political behavior in that period?
Well, absolutely. I mean, becoming elected governor of California in 1966, that was his first political office at age 55, and so beginning his second career. And, at first he didn't really know what he was doing in Sacramento, as you would expect, but then he started to figure it out and actually governed pretty effectively and in ways that frustrated some of his most conservative supporters. I mean, he did things like signing one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country, signing a very tough gun control bill. He often excoriated, hippies and radicals in the universities, and he did send the National Guard into Berkeley, which I think was largely a failure. But he also expanded funding for higher education by 136%. So one of the more fascinating interviews I had for this book was actually talking to Jerry Brown about Ronald Reagan. And Jerry Brown, of course, was the son of Pat Brown, who Reagan defeated in '66, and then was Reagan's successor as governor in the 1970s. And Jerry Brown told me Reagan was a pretty good governor. And that's coming from a leading Democrat. Willie Brown, by the way, the longtime Speaker of the California Assembly, said the same thing to me, pretty good governor. So he actually won a lot of respect in Sacramento, but that didn't really translate into the national stage with a lot of people still holding a lot of these misconceptions about who Reagan was when he was elected president. And just to cite one huge, I mean, there's certain things that I think people just did not realize at the time, and it took years afterwards to figure out. For example, that caricature of him as a warmonger, which was very common in the early 1980s.
I remember.
And of course, he opposed the nuclear freeze initiative, and that gave further credence to this notion that he was some kind of, Dr. Strangelove type. But in fact, just the opposite. Why did he oppose the nuclear freeze initiative? Because he didn't think it went far enough. In the first place, it only covered the United States. It wasn't a freeze for the Soviet Union. But in the second place, he didn't want to just freeze nuclear weapons at their current levels. He wanted to eliminate them, but almost nobody realized that at the time.
And I think that it's fair to say that was also part of the way he thought about the Strategic Defense Initiative. I mean, it's not in the context of, great, this way we'll be able to wage a nuclear war. It's we can render these weapons obsolete. Where did his nuclear allergy come from?
That's a great question. I mean, I think to some extent his aversion to war was very deep-seated, because as a young boy in small-town Illinois, he had memories of watching the doughboys go off to fight in World War I. And of course, in the 20s, there was a massive backlash against the war and this resulting wave of isolationism and pacifism. And he was certainly not immune to that. And he was certainly imbued from an early age with the notion of the horrors of war. And of course, he didn't serve in combat, far from it, in World War II, but he certainly, even from a Hollywood backlot where he spent the entire war, he certainly knew and followed very closely what was going on. And I think, came out of that conflict the second great war of his lifetime, with the further horror of war. And then, of course, in the immediate, very interesting, in the immediate post-war period, he was somebody who was actually, even then, talking, when he was still a liberal, talking about the need for international control of nuclear weapons, or try to abolish nuclear weapons, one world government. This was before he moved to the right. So he was very worried about these issues, even at the very dawn of the nuclear age. And that concern certainly never left him. And I think it was, heightened when he became president. And for example, during his early in his administration, he sat through a very highly classified nuclear war game where he saw the impact of a nuclear war, and he saw the entire United States basically being destroyed in a Soviet nuclear strike. And that's a very sobering experience for him. And I think his desire to rid the world of nuclear weapons was further confirmed by the aftermath of his shooting. Of course, he almost died at the beginning of his presidency, and he had these, he didn't wear his religion on his sleeves, but he certainly had religious beliefs instilled in him by his mother, who was a devout member of the Disciples for Christ. And Reagan's takeaway from his shooting was that the Almighty had saved him for a purpose, and that was to lift the threat of nuclear Armageddon. So he thought that there was he thought that he was part of a divine plan to save humanity from from this looming threat.
Yeah. Could we're running a little bit short, so let me there are two big things I want to work through with you. One is Reagan as a person. I think this is one of the areas where he just seems most enigmatic, because on the one hand, as you report, people who knew him found him charming, kind, sort of very pleasant to be around, inexhaustible fund of jokes. This, as everybody says, this, he and Tip O'Neill could tell they could fight like hell and then tell Irish jokes and sip Irish whiskey. And yet, he's also the guy who forgets you exist when you walk out of the room, who has very strained relations with his adult children, who even some of the people who admired him most just view him as kind of remote and kind of untouchable in a sort of an emotional sense. Give us your read on that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. That's one of the fundamental paradoxes of Ronald Reagan, that he was could be very avuncular and genial in person or on television, but the people who knew him best thought he was actually very remote and had kind of a glacial reserve at his core. I mean, Jim Baker said to me, you could never forget with him that you were hired hands, you were not friends, and he could be very happy to have you serving him today, and then you could be gone tomorrow, and he'd never remember that you were here in the first place. And that was, George H.W. Bush, his faithful and loyal vice president for 8 years, but the Bushes were never once invited to the family quarters of the White House. He didn't have a lot of real friends, almost none, in fact.
Why do you think that is?
I really, at the risk of sounding Freudian here, I really trace it back to his childhood once again, to this very difficult itinerant childhood. And he wrote about his childhood in very rose-colored terms, as he did everything, that he kind of reshaped reality to his own liking. But if you look at what actually happened, it was actually a very difficult, even traumatic childhood, because his father, Jack, was this alcoholic shoe salesman who kept losing one job after another, and the family kept moving from small town to small town in rural Illinois. And so he was never really in one place long enough to form deep friendships with any of the other kids. And he was actually kind of an introvert and a loner, which is like the last thing you would associate with Ronald Reagan. But he was the kid who preferred, reading in the attic to playing with the other kids. And so he kind of, during this very difficult childhood, which also led him to have this aversion to personality conflict, because of course his parents were often in conflict when his dad would go off on a multi-day bender and come back home, and his mother Nellie was not very happy about that. So he kind of erected this kind of mental fence around himself, where even Nancy Reagan, the person closest to him for most of his life, said that there was a part of him that was walled off even from her. So that's how remote and inscrutable he could be to even those closest to him.
I think maybe a somewhat more extreme version of things I've seen in other politicians, who've had difficult childhoods, so they have this need for kind of external applause or adulation, but there's some part that they keep deep inside. It may not be a profession which is optimized for people who just have, kind of happy.
No, I think that's right. But I think Reagan was definitely not a backslapping individual. He was not Bill Clinton. He was not somebody who fed off the energy of other people. I mean, he could be perfectly entertaining, but as his son Ron told me, his idea of a great evening was to go home with Nancy, sit in front of the TV, eat dinner, watch Bonanza or Gunsmoke, read a little bit, and go to bed. He wasn't somebody who was out there socializing. He never called any friends actively. I mean, he would call people, like the staff said, like, call Senator so-and-so to get their vote. He would do that, but he didn't have any friends that he would call up. He would never say, let's go grab a beer or something like that. That was just not Ronald Reagan.
Interesting. Fascinating. Max, so you wrote this book over the last decade, basically, and you can tell that there's a decade's worth of really deep research, and not just deep research, but also beautiful writing. I know enough to know that you don't write something like this off the top of your head. You labor over it, and you agonize over it, and you sweat blood. So you can see. I mean, you don't. When you're reading through it, you don't feel that, and it's precisely because you've been through that it reads that way. But I suspect, and you can tell me that I'm way off base, that if Max Boot had begun this project, say, in the year 2000 and published it in the year 2010, it would be a somewhat different book. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
So could you talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, because I'm somebody who grew up, having tremendous affection for Ronald Reagan. I mean, he really helped to make me a conservative and a Republican in the 1980s. Helped by my family background, because I came here when I was 6 years old with my family from the Soviet Union. So like a lot of emigres from communist countries, I emigrated to the right, and thrilled when Reagan called out the evil empire and castigated Soviet human rights abuses. And so he it wasn't just me. I mean, I think he kind of made conservatism cool in the 1980s and recruited a lot of people to the right. But then, of course, Donald Trump comes along, and the day after the 2016 election, I re-registered as an independent. And I think that was actually a very good move for me, kind of intellectually and as a writer.
Me too.
Yeah. Because, I don't think this would have been nearly as good of a book if it had been written through the prism of party loyalty or affection for Reagan. And to be clear, I still have some personal affection for Reagan. It's hard not to be charmed by him in some ways, but I'm certainly did not write this as a partisan or somebody who was out to, rationalize or defend his legacy or to defend the Republican Party. I was just really, so I kind of thank Mr. Trump for giving me that objectivity and that distance that I needed from the Republican Party, I think, to write much more objectively about Reagan and his life and legacy.
And to your credit, and to be very clear to those who have not yet read the book, it's not as though you go to say, okay, Trump is a sort of a lineal descendant of Ronald Reagan, which he isn't. I very much agree with you as somebody who, I think my journey was a bit different, but it's similar in some ways. There is something that is very freeing about not being associated with a political party and being wary of partisan politics and the kinds of judgments that they bring along. Max, we've been going for a good while. I just want to say again, this is a fantastic book. I urge you all to go out and buy it, and I assure you will enjoy reading it, and you'll read it more quickly than you might think. Because
Thank you very much.
really rattles along. So thank you for coming to CSIS.
Thank you. Great conversation. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.